On the other hand, I'm really excited about the chance to talk to you about this book because it really grew out of an interest in finding more talent for a nonprofit sector that's growing rapidly and is ever more important to the well-being of the country. And really, Civic Ventures, even though we've worked on aging issues and issues of retirement and the next stage for the baby boomers, didn't start out as an organization with a gerontological background. I spent the first 15 years of my career working for an organization focusing on young people growing up in poverty and on the issues of where are we going to find human beings who can do those things that only people can do to help kids and schools and youth programs, and came to this interest in the time, talent, and experience in the older population and the baby boom generation as a resource for the nonprofit sector, for education, for young people. And so it's really, that's ultimately where my heart is and our organizational focus is how do we find a way where we can simultaneously help a growing group of people find new meaning and also realize a windfall of talent for those things in our country that matter most. We're about to have a big change in the composition of the populations. Kathy mentioned there are all of these baby boomers, myself included. I was born in 1958, who are moving into our 50s and 60s, and we've heard about a demographic revolution. Every 8 seconds, someone in this country turns 60. Already, half the people who've ever lived to 60 in the history of the United States are alive, and that population's about to double over the next 30 years till between 20 and 25% of the entire population of the country is over 60. That's unprecedented soon for the first time in the history of our country. Country we've always thought of as a young nation, a nation of up-and-coming young people. There'll be more people over 60 than under 20 in the United States. So these changes are enormous, and actually relative to much of the rest of the world, we are a young nation. By the middle of the century, over 40% of the population in Germany, Spain, Italy, South Korea, Japan will be over the age of 60, over 40%. So these changes are pretty significant. And already, even though they haven't fully unfolded, the verdict is in. We're told that we're entering the Floridization of America. And I know, talking to an audience in Georgia, that's particularly insulting. But in fact, it's an understatement. The population in the country will actually be a higher proportion, the population of people over 60, than in Florida today. So that's another sort of indicator of how big these changes are. The verdict's already in. It's an unmitigated disaster and an unavoidable one. Demography is destiny, we're told. Soon a long gray wave of greedy geezers will take America to the cleaners, bankrupting not only the federal government, but posterity. It seems to be this conclusion seems to be one of the few things that Americans of all political stripes managed to agree on. Pete Peterson, the former Commerce Secretary in the Nixon administration, now one of the heads of the Blackstone Group, says graying means paying. Lester Thoreau, who's a liberal Democrat who started out in the LBJ, Council of Economic Advisors, says we have met the enemy, and he is the elderly us. In fact, he tells a story about Kalkaska, Michigan, a town in the Upper Peninsula where the particularly civic-minded older population, after a snowy winter a few years ago, shut down the schools in April so that the money could be rediverted to snow removal. And he gives us Kalkaska as a picture of where the nation is headed, this generational war of young against old that had a particularly extreme rendition in the Atlantic Monthly last year, an article by James Mann called "The Coming Death Shortage," which I think inspired Christopher Buckley's new book, Boomsday, that some of you probably have read about. Christopher Buckley, the author of Thank You for Smoking, Boomsday has been called Thank You for Dying. In it, Cassandra Devine, a young Gen Xer who's angry at her selfish baby boomer father, comes up, and she's working in Washington as a policy advisor, comes up with this idea of transitioning. Transitioning is euthanasia for boomers at age 65. In return for going to the great beyond, they get various tax incentives and their families benefit greatly. So there's some new and creative ideas being put forward about what we can do about this demographic tsunami. In fact, when you look at how these changes in the population are covered, it seems like they're all being done by the Weather Channel. It's the fiscal hurricane, the demographic tsunami, the age wave. It looks bad, right? But I think that they're, without in any way minimizing the genuine and somewhat wrenching fiscal issues that we're going to have to face around particularly Medicare, Medicaid, also Social Security, and the need to act quickly to minimize pain in making changes in those programs as the population changes. I think that the problems, particularly with Social Security, are frequently overblown, but there are necessary changes. The central problem with most of the Cassandras, with most of the hand-wringing about this great gray, greedy wave that's coming our way, has to do with bringing together of these new numbers, which are staggering, these new population changes, the sheer number of people in this country who are going to be over 60, with the old lifestyle, with the approach towards this period in life that was pioneered by their parents' generation and their parents' parents, and that worked spectacularly well for half a century, but that has, in many ways, run its course. And so we're told that we'll soon have a quarter of the population spending a third of their life in subsidized leisure. And if, in fact, that was the end result of all of this, there would be a fiscal tsunami and there would be a generational war, although I'm not quite sure that we would end up with a Christopher Buckley conclusion to a resolution to these issues. But what's happening actually is that the numbers are changing, but that the nature of this stage of life is under radical revision. And to understand why that's happening, how that's happening, where we're heading towards, I think it's important to understand a little bit about where we're coming from. And to do that, I'm going to just rummage quickly back through the sort of social history of aging and retirement over the last 7,500 years, in part because I always wanted to go to grad school in American history, but I didn't have enough discipline to do that, so now I get to inflict my interest on all of you at 9 o'clock in the morning. But it is, I think it's really helpful to understand how things have unfolded, because up to this point they've all made tremendous sense. But they've also been, we've seen massive changes over the last 100 years, and I think we're going to need to change again in the way that we managed to be resilient in the past. So oftentimes when I give this talk, I go all the way back to the Puritans, and the Puritans are actually pretty interesting because they had a radically different conception of old age than we have today, but in fact one which pretty closely approximates where we need to go. And I'll just say a few words, which is that the Puritans had a great reverence for age. They felt that if you lived to a ripe old age, it was a sign from the divine. It was a sign of grace. It meant that you were closer to God, and you were being rewarded by longer life. And so the Puritans actually did everything possible to look old. Where every time you open up Parade or People or the Journal-Constitution, I'm sure you see all these anti-aging ads. That would have seemed very odd to the Puritans. They would have wanted ads about how you could get older faster. They used to cut their clothes so that their shoulders sloped and they were hunched over. that they looked old. And when I saw that, I felt this great sense of relief. I was, if I'd only been born 400 years earlier, I would have had good posture. And so I'm generally at this 45-degree angle leaning forward. But they lied. They took a census, and they would lie on the census and say that they were 3 or 4 years older than they actually were. We do the opposite now. We say we're 3 or 4 years younger than we actually are. They wore white wigs, and they had a wonderful expression, a hoary head is a crown of gold. I didn't realize that hoary meant white-haired. It was contrasted very much with my notion of the Puritan sensibility. But that they believed truly that that if you lived to a ripe old age, it meant that you were wise and a person of grace. It was also a subsistence agricultural society where they needed everybody to work as long as they possibly could. Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Grey Panthers, had a great expression. She said, "We don't have a single person to waste." And I think coming from my own background, coming out of the human services and education, I certainly believe what Kuhn had to say, and it was true back 400 years ago as well in a society where all hands were needed. But, through the 17th and 18th and 19th century, we went through a gradual process in this country of trying to move older people out of the workforce. And that culminated 70-odd years ago with the passage of Social Security, which I regard as the high water mark of all of American social policy. But its intended consequence, on the one hand, was to free older people up from poverty and desperation in the heart of the Depression, which it did magnificently, and set in motion all the progress we've made around age and poverty, to the point where, even in the early 1960s, 40% of the older population was living below the poverty line. Now it's fewer than 10%. So that whole process was extremely positive and important, and it's one of the things we can look back to in our policy making from the last century and say we succeeded remarkably well. But the other goal of Social Security, just as important, was to get older people out of the workforce, because we were mired in the Depression. Huge proportion of the younger population, close to a quarter, were out of work. We were creating the Civilian Conservation Corps and many of the other New Deal programs to try to get young people to work in some ways. And a lot of it was fear of social unrest. There were Bolshevik revolutions happening in Eastern Europe, and great concern that the same thing would happen here. It's hard to imagine that from the vantage of 2007, but a big goal was essentially to get these idle young people engaged, and a potential solution was getting older people out of the workplace, and that was embraced by labor unions who saw this as a way to get new members, by employers and corporations who saw it as a way of getting rid of higher paid older employees and bringing in lower paid younger employees, and by policymakers who were essentially trying to create this space in the labor market. And we did really well on that front too. So Social Security succeeded in its two intended goals, but there was an unintended result as well, which is that people started living longer and healthier lives, continuing to be vigorous into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. And this question of purpose became increasingly prominent. What do you do in this period between the end of work and the end of life? In fact, in 1949, Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, got up in front of the UAW convention in Milwaukee, and he talked about pensions, and he uttered a line describing older people in America and people in retirement, UAW members in particular, as too old to work, too young to die, hanging in this sort of limbo state, dangling at the end of the lifespan, but dangling there for a protracted period of time with no purpose, no sense of what to do, why to get up in the morning. And what Reuther talked about it as a tragedy, and a lot of other, if you go back and read commentaries from that period, Lewis Mumford, a great American social critic in the mid-50s, described older people in the country. He said, at no point had any group been so rejected as older people today. It was really, it was an awkward time for millions of people, and people just dreaded getting older. And this turned out to be a problem not just for the older population, but for the pension industry. Very difficult to sell pensions and other financial products around retirement to a group of people who were dreading this period. Why would you defer money and income and invest in something that, promised so little? And so in the early 1950s, the executives of all the major insurance companies and pension companies got together in Corning, New York, and said, we've got a major problem. How are we going to rebrand this notion of retirement so that people will actually look forward to it? And they thought about a lot of different ideas, and then somebody came up with the brilliant idea to tell people that actually they weren't the most rejected group of any in the history of the country. They weren't in a role-less role. They weren't dangling at the end of the lifespan. Actually, they were lucky. They were the first American aristocrats. They had leisure. This is the first time that leisure had been given to people on a mass scale. And it reminds me, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Say Anything with John Cusack. There's a great scene in which John Cusack gets jilted by his girlfriend, and it's a rainy Saturday night in Seattle, and he's beside himself, and so he goes down to the Gas and Sip to see his buddies. And they're trying to cheer him up, and they're telling him there's lots of fish in the sea, that he shouldn't worry about it. And he, is starting to feel better. And then all of a sudden he realizes he's standing in the rain at the Gas and Sip with his buddies. And he asks them, well, if there's so many fish in the sea, what are you doing here in the rain on a Saturday night? And they're suddenly, there's this kerfluffle. And then one of them comes forward and said, by choice. And that's essentially what the insurance companies told older Americans in the early 50s. You're not rejected. Actually, you're lucky. You chose this. And they started a massive reinvention of retirement campaign that told men that they were now free to go to the ball game in the middle of the afternoon. And you started to see this sort of shift in attitudes. And people were, we're human beings. We want to make the best of our situation. And this notion of kind of making a virtue out of a necessity started to catch on. But it wasn't really until the end of the 1950s that the big change happened. And amidst all of these big swirling social conditions that were lining up, growth in pensions, increased health and longevity, expansion of Social Security, general prosperity, all these big things were happening, but it took a particular person and a particular idea, innovation, entrepreneurial breakthrough to make all of this kind of snap into place. And this is one of those rare moments in American history where you can actually pick the day, the place, the person where everything changed. And the day was January 1st, 1960. The place was a former cotton field in Peoria, Arizona. And the person was a guy by the name of Delbert E. Webb, also known as Del Webb, who invented Sun City, the first large-scale, leisure-focused retirement community in America, and sold it sold it to people as a place where they could go for an active new way of life. And it's a remarkable tale. I mean, Webb himself he's a high school dropout from Fresno, who became a carpenter and whose real goal in life was to become a Major League Baseball player. And he would sign on with various construction companies if they had a sandlot baseball team. And then in his late 20s, he was a terrible baseball player, but he's a huge guy, about 6'6", 250 pounds. He gets typhoid fever, and he's at death's door. They send him to Phoenix to convalesce. He's below 100 pounds. And 2 years later, he's building the Arizona State Capitol. And nobody knows exactly how that happened. In some ways, it's like Robert Johnson, the blues musician who supposedly meets the devil at the crossroads and becomes the greatest guitar player in the history of the world. Well, Del Webb met somebody. I don't know if it was the devil, but he turned into the singular, most influential entrepreneur of leisure in America over the last 50 years. He invented the motel. He built Las Vegas. It's Del Webb's Flamingo that Bugsy Siegel's building in the movie Bugsy. And apparently there's this altercation when Webb finds out about Siegel's mob ties and confronts him, and Siegel says, oh, don't worry, we only kill each other. So they opened Del Webb's Flamingo. Webb built Madison Square Garden. He built all of the Space Center stuff in Houston. He built the Japanese internment camps. When asked about if he felt any moral conflict over that, he said, no, a job's a job. And he also invented retirement as we know it. He coined the phrase the golden years, and he opened Sun City on January 1st, 1960, against the advice of every expert, psychiatrist, gerontologist, geriatrician that they had consulted over a 10-year period. And they're about to open Sun City. They've poured millions of dollars in late 1950s dollars, so tens of millions of 2007 dollars into this enterprise. Turn this cotton field into a golf course and put these Levittown-style houses on the course. And on New Year's Eve, Webb's lieutenants are eating dinner at Manuel's place the previous night. It's supposed to open the next morning on January 1st, and there's an unease among them, and they're worried about what's going to happen. And finally, the head of sales says, how am I ever going to sell a 30-year mortgage to somebody who's 65 years old? And they realized, oh my God, this was a terrible idea. The experts were right. And so they went home and they tossed and turned and prepared for their impending being fired. And the next day, 100,000 people showed up. You know, that expression, if you build it, they will come. There, even if they had a traffic jam for 20 miles coming into Sun City. They couldn't even get Webb in. They had to drive him over the irrigation ditches. But there was this deep, inchoate longing on the part of older people in the country for something different. I think if you had done focus groups and surveys, they wouldn't have even been able to articulate it. But this brilliant entrepreneur just intuited it. And part of the longing was to live an active new way of life. People were just tired of sitting around being passive. But it was also to escape being older, because Webb's great genius was if you created a community where everybody was old, nobody was old. Age didn't matter anymore. And that was the third part. It was a community. And so, you know, over the next 10, 15, 20 years, that notion of the golden years really caught on, and activity became the hallmark, along with leisure, of the second half of life. And what was once a push became a pull. People were no longer content to begin the golden years when they were in their mid-60s. Early retirement replaced retirement as the objective, and you see the retirement age dropping till the early 60s, ultimately to the late 50s. And there was essentially a race out of the workplace, a race to be liberated from labor, to what might be called a dream around the notion of the freedom from work. And I tell that whole story because now it's some 40 years later, and there's all this hand-wringing saying that we can't afford all these people leaving the labor market in their late 50s, living off the taxes of the middle generation. And that this notion of the freedom from work for these people is going to turn into an extraordinary burden around work for people in the 30 to 55 age group, who are going to have to put in second, third, fourth shifts to support not only the truly dependent children and the elderly, but this vast wave of boomers trying to live out the golden years dream. But to go back to what I was saying earlier, it's not just the numbers, it's the nature of this phase in life that's undergoing radical revision. You know, while some people are retiring in their late 50s, much as their parents' generation did, what we're seeing increasingly is that after a few years, and people are retiring at that point, in many cases, because they're exhausted. We're working ridiculously long hours in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 162 more hours a year than we did in the early 1970s. People are essentially shoehorning 13 months of work into 12. So there is just a national fatigue among people who are at this juncture. And there's also, because of those long hours, so many things that are deferred. The list of trips and home repairs and reading and all those other things, seeing friends and family has grown increasingly long. So a lot of people are either being pushed into a kind of retirement, or they're being pulled into it out of exhaustion and various dreams deferred. But after 3 or 4 or 5 years of this kind of retirement, many people are saying that, first of all, they can't afford it any longer, but they're rested and they're restless and they're ready for this next phase in their lives. But they're coming up against a unique problem, which is what do you do next? Who do you be next? They're there's a kind of identity crisis and a great anxiety about that. You're not young anymore, but you're not old. You're not elderly or a senior citizen or aged or a codger or a greedy geezer or you can go on and on and on, but there's a failure of language. What do you even call yourself? And with that is a big question about what success is in this period of life. What's the new dream? If the golden years is not what it used to be, if it's tarnished at this point, what do you aspire to in this upcoming period? And that would be a sort of academic question if it wasn't for two things. First of all, as we talked about, big number of people are coming, tens of millions of people are coming up against this transition. And the second is for a long period of time. It could be a period that's as long as midlife in duration. It could be 20, 25 years. So we're not just talking about some discomfort for, in the leftover time between true full-on retirement and the time that people are making this transition. So, and really what's happening, and the reason it's so awkward, and the reason there's so much anxiety, and the reason there's so little language to describe what's going on, is that these people are pioneers on the frontier of what's a new stage of life. And this is a historic development. We only invent new life stages about once every 100 years in this country. There was no such thing as a teenager before the early part of the last century, and then there was this proliferation of young people they weren't children, they weren't adults, and we invented this idea of adolescence. And then soon, we gave it a name. We invented junior high schools and middle schools. We invented public policies and products. And pretty soon this whole kind of cultural category of the adolescent came into being. And actually the same thing happened with childhood 2 centuries before that. And now the space that's opening up between the end of people's first careers and true old age and true full-on retirement is essentially a new stage of life. Yet we haven't figured out what to call it. We haven't figured out what to call people who are in that stage. We haven't figured out what success is, what's the new dream. And again, that matters because we're talking about a lot of people for a long period of time. You hear these phrases, 60's the new 30, and Lauren Hutton gets placed on the cover of AARP's magazine looking spectacular, 60's the new 40, 60's the new 50. In fact, somebody even did a survey last year asking people who were 60 whether it was the new 30, 40, or 50. In fact, 60 is the new 60. It is a new stage of life, and the sooner we realize that, demography isn't destiny, that it's not just a version of what came before, that it's actually an opportunity to create something new, the better off we'll be. And I think that one part of the definition is already becoming clear, and it's work. We're inventing not just a new stage of life, but a new stage of work. After years and years and years of the proportion of people in the workforce after the age of 60 going down, it's now started to go up. And when we see every survey that's done of boomers, we find out that 80%, 75%, 85% are planning to work in what used to be retirement. And that's actually one of the signs that something new is beginning to be created. You get a rise of oxymorons. I remember when I was in the 6th grade and the teacher put up all of these words like palindrome and oxymoron. I can never remember what they were. But you see all these opposites being jammed together. The young old, working in retirement jobs, retire to your dream job. I thought retirement was not working, and I thought a job was work. So, and when the language starts collapsing on itself and these opposites start, being in close proximity like that, something big is about to happen. That we're on the verge of creating a new word, not something that's just a version of the old. And so it's already started to happen. People they may retire for a while if they're lucky, but it's really a sabbatical. And then they're unretiring and they're engaging in trying to figure out what this new stage of life is about, and they're starting to go back to work. And the question then becomes, what kind of work do we want to do in this stage of our lives? Do we want to soldier on and do the same things that we've already been doing for 25 or 30 years. In some cases, yes, but frequently not. And I think that was the big lesson I learned in writing this book. Part of it's about longevity. I mean, we're going to need to work longer for a whole set of reasons. But also, first careers are ending earlier. Just take a look at law, accounting, journalism. You see there's tremendous pressure in so many different professions for people to finish after 25 years or so. And those professions are becoming in many ways like the military career. You know, you're out by the time you're 50. But there's also a kind of boomer restlessness about work. It used to be that we got up and we went to work primarily for a paycheck, but meaning has become increasingly important. People are looking for identity and connections, but also a sense of purpose through work, the purpose-driven job, every bit as much as the purpose-driven life. And you look at Studs Terkel's book, Working, which is probably the single best thing ever done about work in this country, and he picks up on this trend. He says Americans get up and go to work every day, every bit as much for daily meaning as for daily bread. And that's particularly true of the boomer generation. And I think that has a lot to do with how many women went to work in that generation. But I'll share another quote with you, which I think captures the essence of what's going on even better than Terkel. It's from Marge Piercy, the poet. She wrote a poem called To Be of Use, and in it, in the closing two lines of that poem, a pitcher cries for water to carry and a person for work that is real. And I think that that's so many people who are at this juncture, meaning has become more important than money for them, and they're looking for something different from work. But let's be honest, work in this stage is, and the reason people are going to work much longer is because we need more money. How are we going to afford all these additional years of health and life? There's going to be increasing pressure from the fiscal perspective for people to continue contributing into the system for longer. We now know that there's a strong association between work and continued health and well-being that goes beyond even questions of meaning. For years and years and years, we thought that prolonged health in this stage of life was a function of genes, but now, thanks to the MacArthur Foundation's 10-year study on successful aging, we know it's actually the opposite, that 70% has to do with lifestyle and only 30% genes. And the authors of the MacArthur study particularly focus on Freud's adage that the keys to health and life are love and work, that strong sense of connection to other people. In fact, the Better Together project at Harvard out of the Kennedy School describes social connection and those kinds of ties as the health club of the 21st century. There are all kinds of benefits associated with connection, and the other is purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, a sense that one's life has direction, that you're still a contributing part, living lives that matter. So there are all those reasons, and then there's another one, which is the vast labor shortages that are opening up in many different sectors of society, but particularly in areas like education, healthcare, nonprofits, the government, the ministry. You go all the way down the line, and finally, there's the huge investment we've made already in the human and social capital of the boomer generation. We couldn't build campuses quickly enough in the 60s when people were heading off to school. The higher education rates skyrocketed in this generation. So we've made a huge investment already. So when you bring all of these things together, you see a very compelling case for longer working lives that could benefit individuals, benefit organizations and employers, benefit the fiscal situation, and potentially even work to bring generations together and to create a society that was more cohesive. But doing that is going to require something that we don't have right now. And the first is a vision of work that people would actually look forward to. Just like we turned the push of retirement into a pull, it was something that people actually, tried to get to as early as possible, as opposed to went to with great dread and at the last possible moment. We need a vision of work that we would want to do, not just for 12 months or 16 months or 18 months longer to benefit the fiscal picture like a lot of labor economists are urging, but where we'd want to invest in a whole new phase in our working lives. And right now, we've made progress on one part of the work spectrum for people who are entering their 60s, and that's the retail sector. And it's mostly been through phased retirement and bridge jobs. And I know Home Depot is one of the sponsors of this conference, and they've just done terrific work with AARP around recruiting older people, providing people benefits and flexibility. And there's a wonderful ad campaign that AARP and Home Depot were running together for a while around the notion passion never retires. And the great pictures of these older people who were Home Depot employees are brimming with satisfaction and everything's working out great. And if you read between the lines, at least when I read between the lines, what I saw were a bunch of men who were in their 60s who, for the last number of years, their passion had shifted from their day job to getting home and fixing things and getting to the tool shed. And essentially what the Home Depot ad was saying is now you can do that. You can make that the centerpiece as opposed to the sideline. You can provide unwanted advice to hundreds of people every day and get paid for it. So actually I was ready to sign up. But it's, I think we've made Starbucks, Borders, Home Depot, a number of other employers have made tremendous headway in reaching out to this population, rearranging work so that people can find satisfaction. What I've focused on over the last 5 years, and that the culmination is in this book, is another group of people who are looking for what might be called an encore career, who've taken a break and who now are ready for another career phase in which they're focusing on what matters most to them. They're looking at this period that could be a decade, 2 decades, and see it as an opportunity for another body of work that could potentially be their greatest work, the thing that they feel proudest of, that they look back to and feel was where they harnessed and harvested all their experience and focused on making the world a better place, essentially searching for a calling in the second half of life. Rather than phasing out into phased retirement, they're focusing in on their passion. They're essentially looking for more from work, not less, more flexibility to be sure, but also more meaning, greater impact. And I tried to understand how they were faring and trying to do something which seemed to be getting everything right. They were contributing to the taxes, they were making increased money, continued income, they were finding new meaning, they were contributing in areas where there were big labor shortages. It seems like we all have a stake in their success, and tried to understand what that experience was like. And we also did a bunch of research to try to understand if the stories of these individuals who were on this journey were idiosyncratic or representative of something much larger. And in fact, they're at the forefront, the vanguard of a much bigger wave. When we did a survey of Americans 50 to 70 2 years ago, we found that half of the leading edge boomers, those 50 to 60, were interested in second careers in education, healthcare, the nonprofit sector, and the government. There's a great interest in work in all those areas that we care so much about and where labor shortages are growing. There was also, particularly in the group 50 to 55, 2/3 of people were interested in second careers in those areas. And if you really, if you're hard-nosed about it and just look at people for whom those are the top priority, 1/4 of people say that working in these areas is their top priority. And they don't want to wait. They want to start and switch between 50 and 55 so they'll have enough time to learn the ropes and to have a body of work to make a significant contribution. And when you ask them specifically what they're looking for, it comes down to people and purpose. They're looking for relationships to work with other people around doing things that are significant. They feel that retirement would afford lots of opportunities for them to see family and friends and have more social relationships, but they want that counterbalanced by purposeful relationships where there's this mix of strong ties to other people, being part of a team that's doing important things. And the second is purpose, to have a direction in their lives. So I think that there's great potential to meet these people halfway and help not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands, really millions of people have encore careers at the intersection of continued income, new meaning, greater impact. But the truth is, right now, you've got a lot of people who are all dressed up with very few places to go. When we ask the same people what they thought their prospects were of finding this new hybrid between the benefits and structure of work and the spirit of service, only 12% felt that they would be able to get there. And that's really tragic when you think that it's not just about their own income and their own meaning, but it's really about meeting huge needs in society. Again, those kind of needs that for people that only human beings are going to be able to satisfy, that we're not going to be able to automate or import. So there's this huge looming opportunity that's not being met. There's essentially what gerontologists call structural lag. The aspirations and desires of people have changed dramatically, but the opportunities are still those that we had for previous generations. So there's a problem with alignment that comes out in the most negative terms in this idea of a society that doesn't make sense anymore, where a small group of people in the middle, again, are being asked to support vast numbers of young people and elderly, and also this middle generation of people in the second half of life who want to work, who have a lot to contribute, but are not going to have that opportunity if things continue the way they have. There have been some great innovations that might be described as structural lead and opposite to the structural lag of particular organizations taking advantage of this opportunity. IBM has had a great and inspirational success with the transition to teaching program, helping their senior science and engineering professionals make the transition into teaching in math and science. There are policy innovations like the Troops to Teachers program, another one in education, which was created by an 86-year-old, twice retired history professor named Jack Hexter at Washington University, who saw the troops coming back from the First Gulf War and was acutely aware of the urban teaching shortage, and saw these sergeants in particular who were coming back and who'd just spent years working with unformed 18-year-olds and thought, wow, maybe they could work with unformed 17-year-olds and become urban public high school teachers. And the Defense Department and Department of Education coming together, and the Troops to Teachers program was born, helping people make this kind of transition and deal with this issue of the absence of pathways from one phase of life to a new period. As exciting as those kinds of innovations are, and also an exciting movement of social entrepreneurship among Americans over the age of 50. A lot of people who are looking out there, are in the group that's not in the 12% who think they're going to find opportunities, who don't like the roles that they see, are essentially rolling up their sleeves and creating new nonprofits and new opportunities within nonprofits. At Civic Ventures, we have something called the Purpose Prize, which was designed to be like the MacArthur Genius Award, but for people over 60 who wanted to change the world. In the first year, last year, we gave the Purpose Prize out. We were giving out 5 prizes. We were expecting 200 nominations. We got 1,500 from all over the country. Same thing happened again this year. There's really a ferment, not only among innovative organizations, but among older people who themselves are seeing problems in their communities that they want to solve. And in many cases, they're creating opportunities for their peers to become engaged as well, like Jack Hexter did with the Troops to Teachers program. So there are lots of signs of hope, but we're going to have to be much more ambitious, much bolder, because the numbers are so huge. And I'll conclude with just a few comments about where we need to go. When you look at aging in this country over the last 50, 75 years, it is inspirational. We concocted things like Social Security, Medicare, the Older Americans Act, out of thin air. They required extraordinary imagination. We invented senior centers. We invented nursing homes. We invented retirement communities. Now they're such a common part of the landscape. It seems like they've always been there, that they're like the oxygen in the air. But in fact, they were created to deal with big changes in our environment. And we're going to need to summon the same kind of imagination in this upcoming period at the policy level, I think we need something that's as big as the GI Bill. It might be called the Third Age Bill, where we once helped people move geographically from abroad back to the United States, from military life to civilian life. I think now we need to help people move from one stage to a new one that's ill-formed, where the consequences are really significant. We're going to need creativity like that of the retirement communities, but at an institutional level, at a community level. So lots of big things are going to have to happen, but it's all anchored in a central idea, which is that for 50 years in this country, we've had a compact with older people. It said basically, if you will please stop contributing, if you will stop working, and really contributing in most other ways as well, we'll make it worth your while. We'll help provide financial incentives for doing that. We'll create new institutions like the retirement communities. We'll create a cultural notion of success anchored in the golden years, which rewarded the freedom from work. And if that doesn't work, we'll discriminate against you until you finally stop working. And it worked. People stopped working. And, you know, there were downsides. There were also, I have to admit, there were a lot of positive things about it. We know activity is good for people, created room in the labor market during a period of labor surplus. There were positive outcomes, but it has run its course. And the New Deal that we need, the new social compact, is almost exactly the opposite. Just like the conditions were lining up for that compact in the 1950s, the conditions are lining up for one that's built around much longer working lives. But the idea of just working 10 years longer, who wants to just do that, right? That's not something that any of us are going to look forward to. We need something that that would be more than a push, that would be a pull, that people could subscribe to voluntarily. And I think it goes something like this. If you agree to have an encore career, to do work that's at the intersection of continued income, greater meaning, significant impact, we'll make it worth your while. First of all, we'll give you a break. We need a sabbatical of some sort in this country. Mary Catherine Bateson, the daughter of the great anthropologist Margaret Mead, wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review 2 years ago in which she called for a midlife atrium. And by that she said basically that midlife in this country is like a run-on sentence. It just goes on and on and on, and it needs punctuation. And just like an atrium in a house, it doesn't just add a room, but it changes the nature of all the other rooms. We need a break. And it could be a time of national service, it could be a time of education, it could be a time of going on trips with your grandkids, and we need to come up with some institutional way of doing that. After all, we have this thing called college for young people, where they get to take 4 years of a break, and we invest hugely in it. Well, now, given what's happened with the life cycle, we need another break. We need much better pathways, including a whole new kind of higher education, essentially school for the second half of life, to help people get to their encore careers. And then we need much better workplace arrangements to help people work in ways where they get essentially the best things about retirement and the best things about work. And I think we need in that, it's the seed of a dream to go from the freedom from work to the freedom to work in new ways, to new and more important ends on new terms. And I think that's a deal that we could buy into if it was crafted right and if it was animated by the kind of imagination that the old arrangement around not working managed to pull off. If we do that, I think we can turn this notion of graying is paying, or even graying is playing, into one that's essentially graying as a payoff. And we can produce, at the most basic level, people who are living longer lives with greater satisfaction. We can produce a windfall for all of the things that we all care about, for the nonprofit sector, for education, for health care, for all those places that need human talent and in big numbers. But ultimately, I think we can do two things. We can go from lives that don't make sense, right? Like, think about how we live our lives. We load everything into the first 20, 25 years. We have to climb the ladder. We have to make maximum income. We have to pay the mortgage. We have to raise kids. And then all of a sudden, you get sort of shoved off this demographic cliff where you're underengaged. There's no balance. We need to find a way to balance the joys and the responsibilities of productivity much more evenly across the lifespan. And second, we need to do that among age groups. It doesn't make sense to have a small group of people in the middle trying to support everybody else. But if we can engage this huge population of people who need to work, who want to work, who are looking for something important from work in this stage of life, we can create a society where there is a new kind of balance, and prove that not only that graying doesn't necessarily mean paying, that demography doesn't necessarily have one destiny, and we can finally realize the hope of Peter Drucker, who passed away last year in his early 90s. He waited long enough to win the McKinsey Award from the Harvard Business Review for the 7th time for the best article in the Harvard Business Review. Drucker said the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think that's the task that's in front of us. But I'll close with one other quote, which is from my mentor and my hero and somebody who's done so much for the nonprofit sector in this country, John Gardner, and whose own life, I think, showed the kind of possibilities of kind of continued engagement. You know, he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. That's the Lifetime Achievement Award. He was already well into his 50s at that point. It's what Greenspan got last year. And everything that John Gardner is remembered for, his work as HEW secretary when she implemented Medicare and the Older Americans Act and huge education reforms, Common Cause and starting the campaign finance reform movement, independent sector, the White House Fellows Program, on and on and on. We're all done in this period of leftover time in his life, the time he was supposed to be exiting this stage. When he died in 2002 at 89, there was a memorial service for him at Stanford. And on the program for the memorial service was just one quote from John. And he'd written so many great books, Self-Renewal, his book on leadership. There are many quotes that they could have picked from, but the one they selected was from the battles over Medicare in 1965. And I felt like it was exactly what we need to hear today. He said, America today faces breathtaking opportunities disguised as unsolvable problems. And I can think of no better benediction for everything that's in front of us now and that could benefit the work that all of us